Sounds
All
good.
right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Topics and Tangents here on Gaming with ADHD, where today I am joined by Tim Beach, a role-playing, would it be safe to say legend at this point?
I have been called that sometimes a little reluctantly, but yes.
All right. Well, then, real quick, just give us a quick introduction, and then we'll get into talking about who you are and what you do.
Okay. Well, I guess the big thing is if any of your audience played second edition D&D, which we used to call AD&D, you almost certainly used something I worked on. I did a ton of stuff for that back in the day, and I've worked for a number of other companies as well. I have a lot of experience in the gaming hobby and industry, and I've just reached the point where I've gotten kind of tired of the expensive, thick rule book that makes you feel like you have to complete coursework first. I wanted something simple, so I made it.
Awesome. All right. Well, then before we get into that, let's get to know who Tim is, because while I know of AD&D second edition,
Right?
I haven't played it. I'm very sorry.
That's okay. You don't have to have played it. That's okay.
Even better. All right. So, all right. So then I guess let's start. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? I mean, obviously you can omit any specific details, but
Well, even saying the name of my town is pretty specific. I grew up in
Oh.
Sharpsburg, Iowa, which is a town of 110 people on a good day. So, it used to be that besides the fact that my dad was the mailman, you could send us something with our last name and the zip code, and it would get to us.
That is extremely specific. So
Yes.
Okay. So grew up in Iowa. I've only visited Iowa once in my life. I was like 10, so I got nothing outside of there was a Mormon settlement there. Because Council Bluffs.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's my only connection to Iowa. So
I was about 90 minutes southeast of Council Bluffs.
okay, cool. So then growing up, like obviously, I mean, you've been involved in gaming now for many years, but I mean, has this always been something that you've been into? I mean, or did you grow up and you're like, nope, I'm the cool kid playing football and screw that nerd stuff?
I definitely wasn't the cool kid, at least not for most of my schooling. So I grew up in like I said, a very small town, and I have a big family. My older brother Jim introduced me to playing Risk when I was about I want to say 8 or 9 years old, and used to just thrash me at it,
as big brothers do.
right? But by the time I got to college, I was the one doing the thrashing. So we started as a gaming family, and having a family as big as mine. I'm the youngest of 8. I don't know if I said that.
Oh wow, that is a big. I thought mine was big with 5 kids, but 8. Wow.
Yeah. Most of them I didn't grow up with. They were much older, but my brother Jim and my sister Jan were the ones that grew up with me. But one of the things that resulted from having a family that liked games was that I grew up having a shelf full of board games that we could play with each other. And so that was a start. And I discovered D&D kind of sideways. I was in junior high, and one of my teachers pulled me out of study hall one day and set me down in front of his TRS-80 computer with a book that was there to learn the basic programming language. And so I started learning basic programming. A couple years later, a year or two later, he switched over to an Apple II Plus, and one of the games he had on that was called Temple of Apshai. And so I played that, and he said, "Yeah, it's kind of like D&D." And I'm like, okay, know nothing about that. But then when I was about a junior or senior, one of my friends got the D&D Red Box for Christmas, and she had no idea what to do with it. And so she and her boyfriend, both good friends of mine, handed me the box and said, well, you've played this game on the computer. Teach us this game. And so I became a DM, and that was how I started D&D.
Wow. Okay. So that's actually kind of interesting. And do not take this the wrong way. But I kind of assumed you were a little older than that.
That's okay. It's the silver hair. I actually have a. Okay.
It's impressive. It's impressive, even for being completely silver. I'll give you that.
Well, I have a little bit of a story about that. I was in Iowa several years ago, about 10 years ago, and I stopped at a Walmart to buy whichever Iron Man movie had just come out. And I took it up to the counter, and the clerk there said, "Oh, is this a good movie?" And I said, "Yeah, we really liked it." And she said, "Oh, do you have grandkids to watch it with?" Really? You went straight to grandkids? but that was when I realized that my hair had gone completely silver.
That is fantastic. Okay, this is going to be our first tangent. I have to ask. Okay, first off, we're going to be very good friends now because you dropped Iron Man. I will admit, my second favorite superhero, but that's only because I found him after Batman. But
okay.
Which of the Iron Man movies was your favorite?
Oh, wow. I've got to go with the first one.
Okay.
Just because it was so unique at the time, and it introduced the whole world of Marvel in a different way. And Iron Man hadn't been, one of the big ones in the comic books, at least not as far as what I could see. I collected the Avengers and some Spider-Man, but Iron Man was a little bit off the radar for me. Until the movie came out, and then it reminded me that I had seen him, and at one point when TSR was publishing the Marvel Superheroes game, I really liked him then too, and I had a lot of the supplements that had all his armors in it and all that kind of stuff. Just fascinating stuff that I loved.
Got it. Okay. Well, I liked him. And I've just met him because I have to agree. I like the first one the best. Now, don't get me wrong. I think 1 and 2 are the best. 3 is okay, but it got a little weird.
Yeah.
But I think 1 was a really good modernization of the story because you still got a lot of that captured POW in Vietnam kind of feel.
Right.
But obviously it's mid 2000s, so war on terror, all that kind of stuff, and really fit him in. And I think they did the character right in that movie. So anyways, all right. Sorry. Again.
No problem.
That was obviously a tangent. Okay, so you basically started DMing as far as getting into the game,
Right.
and actually with some of the stuff that I've watched, I mean, do you still keep in touch with that group? Are you
yes, both of the people I just mentioned. Dawn, the one that got the red box for Christmas, is a Facebook friend now. I haven't seen her in many years.
Sure.
Dave, the guy that was her boyfriend at the time, I'm still good friends with. I try to see him when I go back to Iowa, but that doesn't always work out. And then the other members of that initial group, my friend Wayne, who was and still is one of my best friends. He later, my friend Wayne, became a professor at the college where I went and is now the sponsor of the D&D club that I founded.
Oh, that is fantastic. All right. So then, so as a actually, okay, this will kind of tie into to your project that we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Okay.
And let's see. Oh, this is really weird. For some reason, the chat isn't pulling over right. But one of my regular visitors, the Six World, um, you know, he was asking if you were from Iowa or Idaho,
Oh,
and obviously we confirmed it was Iowa. What part of Iowa was it again?
it's the southwest corner of Iowa.
Okay.
I used to say that my hometown was 2 miles due east of the middle of nowhere.
I mean, that's fair. It's
Yeah,
the Midwest. It gets kind of flat and empty at times.
yeah, it's a little sparse.
Uh, so so you get the you get the red box. I'm gonna guess this was early 80s or so.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Then what were your initial thoughts when you got that starter box? I mean, obviously starter boxes have evolved since then, but you get this thing and you're like, okay, I played a computer game, but what's this?
Right. So one of the well, looking through it, I could pull the comparisons to the computer game. The ability scores were roughly the same. I think a couple of them had different names in the computer game. So there were enough similarities that I could say, okay, that's how a character works. And it didn't take long for me, though. I had been to computer camp a couple of times in high school. And one of my friends from there, Joe, had talked about D&D. And so when I started getting into it, I called him up and I said, hey, Joe, talk to me about D&D. And he said, well, you've got to get the player's handbook and the DMG and the monster manual. And so I listened to him. I went and talked to him. He lived in what would become my college town. And that's where we met. That's where the computer camp was. So I went to see him and we talked about D&D, and he pointed me towards the AD&D books. And so I picked those up at Kmart, of all places, because that's where they were at the time.
The 80s were a different era, man.
Oh, yeah. So then I took him back and I ran badly, a kind of a mixed game of D&D and AD&D with heavy portions of that computer game thrown in. The computer game Temple of Apshai had a lot of giant insects, so did my first couple of adventures.
Okay. So then, I mean, did you find the box easy enough to just like jump in and start running, or?
With the leg up from the computer game and some advice from my friend Joe, it was easy enough to find the rules for making a character and the way the game worked, and the tables that you needed to see to do different things. So yeah, it wasn't too hard to get into.
Okay. And so then, were you always the GM? Did you get to play sometimes, or how that worked for your group?
For that group, I was always the GM.
Okay.
And when I got to college, I actually started playing in a game for the first time, and I had a very good DM to start with, Aaron, who really knew his stuff, and we had a reasonably good group of people that played. A couple of there was the one that didn't want to be touched in person, and then the one that was obnoxiously trying to get in his space. So
wait, so you're saying you went to college with your family? No. Okay. So well, I guess I would be curious. What was it that you were going to college for?
I started off with a major in computer science and a minor in math.
Okay. You say you started off. Did you end that way?
I I did not. um, so I had done really well on my standardized tests, the ACT and the SAT. My math score on the ACT was perfect. I didn't
Wow.
miss it. And so when I got to college for freshman orientation, um, most everybody that was there in this kind of large room, kind of sitting around, they had um, a blank sheet where it would talk about your advisor. My advisor had chosen me in advance.
Oh, wow.
And he was the head of the math department, and he took me around when we were going, when we were talking about classes. He said, "Are you a morning person?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay, no 8 o'clock classes." And he asked me if I had breakfast. I said, "Not usually." He said, "Okay, no 9 o'clock classes." So I started every day my first semester at college at 10 a.m. He did some horse trading. I got somebody into a closed math class of his to get me into a closed poli-sci class, things like that. But eventually I realized it was one day in the computer lab when it struck me, and I looked around at the other computer science major, and I thought, man, they love computers. I like computers. I don't love them. And I thought, what is it I want to do? And I thought to myself, well, I don't really want to sit in front of a computer programming all day. Um, so naturally, I ended up writing it in front of a computer all day. But nevertheless, um, but I started looking around and thinking seriously about game design at this point. And I thought that something that would help give me a background in it and also happen to be within my grasp as a major 4 years in, um, that history was going to be a good major. And so I ended up with a BA in history with minors in computer science and math. And then I went on to get an MA in history as well.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's a dramatic shift from the computer science side. Um, I know for me, like I like, and it's funny because for my regular job, I do some server support, and I'll talk to customers. They're like, "Oh, I'm having this problem." I'm like, "That's great because that's code, and I don't code. I gave up on that when my Java teacher said go teach yourself," and I'm like, and I'm out because I just don't like it. You know, it
Yeah.
I can figure it out, but it's just like it wasn't something that I could see myself just sitting there doing constantly. So
Right. I think, at least for me, it was a perfect combination because the history gave me background to pull from for the stories and the worlds that I would build. And the mathematics and the computer science gave me a very firm grounding in logic. So, programming is not dissimilar from writing a rule set. Uh,
mhm.
you have to do things in a certain order and have a precedence for how things develop. Um, so I think for me, like I said, it was a very good combination. Worked out very nicely.
Sure. So you said like when you said you were thinking about game design in college. I mean, had you already been, like developing games or writing and submitting to D&D or you know
Well, let's see, where does this fit in? Um, okay. And just as an aside, after playing Risk with my brother, I actually developed a sort of a war game when I was in second grade. It was about ant colonies fighting each other's.
That's fantastic.
We had a big property with a lot of ant colonies around. Anyway, so sometime around, this must have been just as I was moving into the master's program, or, finishing up the bachelor's. We did a college bowl thing, the big trivia contest. And my DM, Aaron, was part of the group that was in the college bowl, and a couple of others. And we won our campus, and went to regionals. And regionals was in Oklahoma, and we drove and were wiped out from northern Missouri, was where we were coming from. And we were wiped out by the time we got there. And we basically got off the road, had time for a glass of orange juice and a donut, and got stomped on in our first match.
Oh.
And so we went and regrouped. We went to the hotel room we were staying in and watched an episode of the D&D cartoon, and kind of psyched ourselves up. And then for the second match, we were doing very well. And during the halftime break, we were talking about the D&D cartoon, and the timekeeper for the match piped up and said, "Oh, I used to work for TSR." "Oh, well, how did that happen? How did you get in with TSR?" And he said that, "Well, I went to a lot of conventions and I got recognized for my play, and they invited me to apply." And I thought to myself, well, I can't go to a lot of conventions. I'd been to one or two before this. And I thought, I can't go to a lot of conventions, but I can start one. Because by that point, I was working for the student union, and had my hands on some of the entertainment budget. And so I knew that I could get a little bit of budget to start with. I had met some people at the conventions that I could invite. And so I started a convention, VilCon, Maryville, Missouri, VilCon. And and I invited, let's see, I think I had 5 guests at the first one. Gene Raby and Skip Williams, who were running the RPGA at the time, Role Playing Gamers Association. And I invited also Frank Menser and Penny Petticord, and Merle Rasmussen, who I had run into in a game store in Des Moines and found out later that he wrote Top Secret. And so I invited them to the convention. I gave them basically a place to stay and gas money. And the convention went very well. At one point, we got a little off track, but I just said, okay, everything's pushed back by a half hour. And Gene Raby, running the RPGA at the time, invited me to come and help with Gen Con. And I did not realize that it was a trap. But then I went and I helped run the RPGA at Gen Con, and I think it was maybe my second day at my first Gen Con when Gene and Skip left the headquarters and said, "Okay, Tim, you're in charge."
Wait, I mean, who doesn't like getting thrown in the deep end?
Right.
Okay. So so you went from running. Sorry, I've got some noise in the background. So I mean, was that your introduction to game design, or was that just how you ended up knowing people from TSR?
That was how I ended up knowing people from TSR.
Okay.
But I had been writing my own adventures at the time, and the RPGA was publishing a newszine at the time, and so I submitted some things for that. And then the key point came around with all right, so a little bit more about this. I I was big into student government in college, a little bit in high school, but very much so in college. I was student body president 2 years in college. And when I was getting ready to graduate with my master's, a friend of mine that I had run with as a freshman called me up and said, "Hey, do you still have your Iowa residency?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, they need somebody to run in your district." And I said, "Well, I would be running against a family friend." And he said, "So?" And so just out of college, I ended up running for state representative in Iowa.
Oh, wow.
And I got a third of a vote against an 18-year incumbent, so not too bad. But he and I would go to these events, and we would compliment each other. I think it was one of the last gentlemanly campaigns in the U.S. But by this point, I was helping out more and more with Gen Con. And so I went to Gen Con that year, and Gene asked me if I would be interested in being tournament coordinator for the RPGA, a new position that they were creating. I said, "Well, yes, but I've got this campaign, and I think it would look really bad if I accepted a job right now, a couple months before the election." And so she said, "Okay." And then I ended up there in January for Winter Fantasy back in Lake Geneva, and we talked about it again. And boy, a lot of things happened at that time. But the more articles that I wrote for the newsine and the more stuff like that, the more it was entering my mind to maybe do something. And it hit a lot of points of creativity and logic for me, that I could change the rules, I could draw maps, whatever it was that I could do. It touched on a lot of the creative things that I like to do.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm gonna guess that you lost the election, hence
Right.
you were able to go up to Winter Fantasy.
Mhm.
Sorry, what I lovingly call the Peanut Gallery.
I was gonna play my Disney emoji blitz.
Okay. Anyways, so it's not like I warned everyone this was happening, but
Yeah.
here we are. Oh, which is doing wonders for my ADHD. It's great. So so then when you'd been writing all of this, like, but it also sounds like you weren't done with college yet when you'd been writing and
Correct.
involved with everything.
Correct. And it was as I was finishing up college that I was getting more involved with Gen Con, and then starting the political career. But that specific Gen Con where Gene asked me about being tournament coordinator was one where I had switched majors over to history, and I was really considering it seriously. And so I caught up with Doug Niles after a seminar at Gen Con. He had just written the Mazteca trilogy of books, and I had been studying Mayan and Aztec and Inca history in my history classes. And so I talked to him a little bit after the seminar. And then after Gen Con, I sent him a snail mail letter, and I explained how the Aztec calendar worked and could be adapted to the Forgotten Realms. And then when I got home from Winter Fantasy in January, there was a letter waiting for me from Doug saying he'd gotten behind on writing the box set and would I be interested in contributing to it. So absolutely.
Please, which sections should I contribute to?
Yeah.
No, that is kind of fantastic, and it also kind of seems to fit with, especially a lot of I mean, I think it still happens today, but also a lot of like the early D&D stories where a lot of it kind of came about because of the networking as opposed to the the like, oh, this guy is an amazing writer, this guy's an amazing designer. It's just like, oh, hey, here's somebody who actually had some interest,
Right.
Sure, let's bring them in. So, um, so then the Maztica box set, is that what you would say is your first official credit?
I had a couple things in the newsine before that that I was credited with, and um, there was an RPGA published product for the Living City that it was featured in it. But Maztica, I would consider my first professional credit.
Got it. Okay. And so what made you decide that, you know what, I'm going to go work for these guys as opposed to finding some other, I'm assuming you had been looking for other jobs, coming towards the
Right.
end of college.
Right. Besides the politics thing, I had, in addition to the master's in history, I was working on a teaching degree and concentrating on math. Because if you were a history teacher as a guy, you had to coach something. And if you were a math teacher, there was a chance you wouldn't have to.
Got it. Back to your star football career.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So what made you decide that you wanted to go game design instead of a teaching career?
It was one of those things that seemed like an opportunity that you just don't pass up.
Okay.
A once in a lifetime sort of thing. And I had loved the atmosphere at TSR when I was there. They were great people to be around and work with and talk about creative stuff. And Doug was very encouraging. I found out later that he had actually subcontracted and paid me out of his own pocket from what he was getting for the Maztica box set. And after our first discussion, he paid me half in advance for what I was going to do. So, that kind of encouragement and pointing to say, well, you've actually got some skills here. Like I said, that just was too good to pass up.
Sure. Okay, so a couple of questions that I missed because the chat system's being weird. But all right, so first off, the Six World would like to know, which D&D cartoon character were you?
Personally, I was probably closest to Hank the Ranger. Not quite as self-righteous, but yeah, more Hank the Ranger, even though at that time I was still mostly playing wizards, but it was Hank's style.
Okay, fair enough. And he also wants to know if your political career ended with the one election or did it go any further?
It ended with the one election.
Okay.
I stayed kind of sideways active in politics for a little while, but it wasn't very long before I had moved from Iowa to Wisconsin, and that was a whole different animal.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you get you get in with the Maztica box set. When was it that you finally got hired on full time by TSR?
So the Maztica box set, I had cousins that lived near Lake Geneva. So I went, when I got Doug's letter and I called him and we worked things out, I went and stayed with my cousins for a couple of weeks while I was doing the writing. And between Winter Fantasy and a couple of weeks later, when I went back to work with Doug, the tournament coordinator that they had hired had basically imploded, and it was starting to show at Winter Fantasy that it wasn't suitable for him. He was not suitable for it. So by the time I got back to work with Doug, the tournament coordinator spot was open. And so one night on the way to dinner with Jean, she asked me some questions that were, basic interview questions, and then offered me the tournament coordinator job again, and said, "When could you start?" And I said, "Well, pretty much any time." And this was on a Friday, and she said, "How about Monday?" So I said, "Oh, okay."
I don't think I've ever, well, okay, I was going to say, I don't think I ever had a job offer go that easy. But then I remembered when I got home from Brazil, my dad gave me a job washing windows.
Okay.
That one was really easy, but wasn't as fun as writing game supplements.
Yeah. And so I started as a tournament coordinator at TSR, and I had, boy, and then this is where it really gets convoluted. Because my cubicle at TSR was kind of catty-cornered across from a conference room on the first floor. And so not long after I had started, a design test appeared on my chair one day. And the design test was a copy of the Vikings handbook. And it said, write an encounter based on the Vikings handbook, turn it into Jim Ward's secretary. Jim was head of design at the time. And we'll see what happens. And so I wrote an encounter and turned it in. And I found out later that both Gene and Skip had done the same thing at the same time. We eventually put our encounters together to make an adventure tournament for RPGA. And then 6 months went by. And during this time, we prepped for Gen Con again, went through Gen Con. And a little bit before Gen Con happened, Tim Brown, who was kind of next in line below Jim Ward, Tim helped me move a piece of furniture. And he asked me while we were doing that, he said, "Hey, are you still interested in that design job?" And I said, "Well, yeah, but I've got this commitment to the RPGA for Gen Con. And, I don't think I can, leave them in a lurch." And another person in the design department asked me the same question: "Are you still interested in the design job?" Same answer. And around this time, around Gen Con and a little bit after, I was watching people come in and be interviewed in that conference room that was across from me, and thinking, man, they are interviewing for the job I want. And they had let me join one of the product groups, the Forgotten Realms product group. Jeff Grubb had picked up some of my stuff that Doug Niles didn't use for the Maztica box set. Jeff used it for the first Maztica adventure. And he came by one day and he said, "Hey, how would you like to be credited? Do you want a with or an and?" And I said, "If you're offering an and, I'll take it." So the adventure Fires of Zatal is by Jeff Grubb and Tim Beach, which I thought was pretty awesome too.
So real quick,
yeah,
as someone who, I mean, I kind of understand it, but what's the advantage to an and over a with? Because the way that you described it, you're like, oh, well, if you're offering and,
it seemed to me that with would be like more of a subordinate role, and
Okay.
and seemed closer to an equal role. And our writing certainly wasn't equal in the adventure, but the offer of the and was very nice of Jeff, and I absolutely took it.
That's true. I mean, yeah, I mean, to me, with kind of sounds like, okay, maybe you put in like a couple of monsters or like a sidebar or something, but
and that is pretty much exactly what it turned out to be. A couple of monsters, and I think I did an adventure, and I think I had described the outer planes from the view of the Aztec Mayan point of view. So yeah, it wasn't a lot that got into the adventure.
Yeah, but you got your and, so
Exactly.
I mean,
yes.
just take it and run.
So anyway, I'm in the product group for the Forgotten Realms. Jeff is a major player in that because he was the lead designer in Forgotten Realms at the time. And so I'm watching people interview, and then one day I go in. So one day I go into work, and I get a call from our computer department. Her name was Judy. And Judy said, "You're transferring to design, right?" And I said, "Well, I hadn't heard."
No one told me.
and she said, "Oh, well, I guess I should ask Gina and Skip." And I said, "Yeah, that'd be a good idea." And so this was a Monday, and Monday was when the Forgotten Realms group met. And at the Forgotten Realms group meeting that afternoon, they're talking about, oh, we hired Rich Baker as a designer, and we hired Thomas Reed and John Ratliff as editors. Does anybody know who the other designer is? And I'm thinking, maybe.
I've heard some hints, a couple of
I don't
rumors.
really want to say anything here in a public place in case the information I got was wrong. But I did catch Jeff afterwards, and I said, "Hey, I got a funny call this morning." And he went and he tried to check it out, and he couldn't find anything out. And they made me wait. That was Monday. They made me wait until Thursday before they confirmed it.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, real quick, backtracking a little bit,
Sure.
because I know you said it, but I forget. But From the Hilt in chat would like to know, what was the name of the book you wrote with Jeff Grubb?
The adventure was called Fires of Zatal, Z-A-T-A-L.
That's right, Fires of Zatal.
Mm-hmm.
So then he also asked earlier, Tim Beach, why does your name sound so familiar?
Well, I put together the Monstrous Manual for second edition. I wrote Thrycreen of Athos for Dark Sun, Partefactal's Manifesto for Planescape, City of Delights for Al-Qadim, Flint's Axe, and a good portion of Unsung Heroes for Dragonlance, the Red Steel campaign setting, and the Savage Barony supplement for it. A bunch of Forgotten Realms stuff, but the cherry on top of that was Pages from the Mages with Ed Greenwood.
Wow. You even got an and with Ed Greenwood. So fantastic.
Well, it was the credits were inside there.
So
it wasn't quite the same.
Only a with on that one. I hate it when that happens. No, it's so no, I think this is fantastic. Like seeing how this all evolved, because I mean you hear stories about like a lot of like the big names, the Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, mm-hmm. and just the big names in the industry. But I think it's kind of interesting, just somebody who's obviously had your fingers in all sorts of pies in the history of this. I think is fantastic. So, and Chris says he recognizes it from Al-Qadim, and he loved that campaign. So okay. There you go.
All right. That was a fun box set to work on. It was a lot of fun.
So then, so what was it like shifting from, basically we'll call it just a kind of a mid-level bureaucrat, because you're just, taking care of the tournament scene and making sure that all goes off at the different conventions. What was it like shifting over? And it's like, wait a second, I actually get to make this official stuff.
Right. Well, just using my key card to get in the building, the thrill of that had not worn off by the time I started in design. Every day I'd go in, use my key card, and think, cool.
I know. I always worry that like I've got a big trip coming up. Wow, holy crap! Literally just over a week, and I always worry that like I'm gonna come back to work and the key card's not gonna work. So
there is a story about a round of layoffs at TSR where people that got laid off while they were away found out that way.
Oh, so I have grounded fears, you're saying?
Well, not necessarily for you, but certainly at that time period in TSR, it was a legitimate fear. they fired a couple of people while they were at a convention representing TSR.
Oh, jeez.
And some of the older guys would talk about it sweeping from one end of the building to the other, that, you know, you felt like you had to paint sheep's blood above your door when you passed over. And, but when I was with TSR, it was pretty stable, and we were hiring designers from other companies at the time too. So that was much different atmosphere from the one that had preceded me. But it was wonderful to be able to work creatively on more projects. And to be a reasonable, a recognized part of the product groups for Forgotten Realms and so forth, and to be able to bid on a project and actually have a chance of getting it. So that was it was wonderful. There is one side story that I want to tell. Working for the RPGA, I had gotten in contact with a lot of conventions. And as a result, I got invited to a lot of conventions, much more than, you know, my position on the totem pole would have justified.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to a convention in Texas at Texas A&M, WarCon, and which I believe is still running. I'd be surprised if it weren't, actually. And so I was at this convention in Texas, and the organizers came up to me and said, "Hey, we've got this panel that we could use another guest speaker, and it's on world design. Would you be willing to be on it?" And I'm like, "Sure." Who else is on it? "Oh, Gary Gygax." Okay.
Hey, was he already out of TSR at that point?
Yeah, he was long
Okay.
out of TSR, and I had met him at a convention before this point, and he signed a few books for me, and he gave me a good piece of advice, I think, and the way he phrased it is something that I have good memories of. But I said, you know, I'm thinking about becoming a game designer, and he said, "Well, you know, if you want to write, you can sit down and you can smoke a joint, or you can sit down and you can write." And it's your choice which way that goes. I thought, oh, okay, well, then I guess I will write.
Again, the 80s were a different time.
Yes. And it's and it's the same advice that people like Stephen King give, that if you want to write, then write.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you need to do, and read. But anyway, so I was at this convention in Texas, and they invited me to be on the panel with Gary Gygax. And I had been in the industry the equivalent of 15 minutes. and he had helped create it, largely responsible for creating the gaming industry. And he was extremely cordial and just a wonderful gentleman about it.
Mm-hmm.
If he agreed with me, he would say that he agreed, and said, "Yes, that's right. That's what I do." And if he disagreed, he was very gentle about it, and he might say something like, "Well, I might do it this way." So it was a really, really good experience for me. And that was the second time that I'd really met him. By that point, I had heard rumors about him being difficult to work with, but this was such a wonderful experience. And then a few years later at a Gen Con, I caught up with him, and I was able to thank him for that.
Sure. No, and like it is also kind of interesting, because I think with this particular industry, like I had a friend of mine who's actually a board game designer on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about how he went to Essen, and he's like I had like 5 people lined up to get my autograph.
Yeah.
You know, because there is this kind of weird, I don't know, it's not necessarily weird, but it is kind of a weird sort of celebrity status in gaming where like technically nobody knows who the designers are,
Right.
unless you are specifically in this kind of a group. And I think it also has a tendency to, you know, kind of, you know, put them up on a pedestal, whether they should or should not be there. But then it also ends up kind of coloring everybody's perception of who that person is, how they are. You know, like you said, you heard rumors about how he was difficult to work with, but then you never had anything but a positive experience or
Right.
interaction with him, at least if I'm interpreting that correctly.
That's
So
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, that is one of those just kind of cool stories, but also like, so real quick, in the chat, from the Hilt is saying, I think maybe Gary chose the first one more often than not between smoking the joint and writing. I don't know.
You know, I don't want to say, but there was a time when he was kind of locked out of TSR and the creative process. So you got to do something.
Right. Yeah. That's fair.
And, and whatever somebody wants to do on their free time, that's up to them.
Exactly. And then because we also have Nerdy Ogre in the chat saying, why can't you do both? I mean,
some people feel like it enhances their creativity.
I'll be honest, I have no clue. I am as straight laced as they come as far as all of that stuff is concerned. But yeah. I'm not going to begrudge anyone. But again, I actually think that does kind of reinforce what I was saying, where we got one person's, oh yeah, no, Gary had to have been, toking it all the time. And then they're just like, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
So then so how long did you end up working for TSR?
About 4 years. Wait a minute. I was hired at the beginning of 90. Yeah, at the beginning of 91, and then I left TSR in early 1995.
Okay.
So about 4.5 years.
Okay. What? Okay, because I don't want to jump necessarily to post TSR yet. So We'll backtrack a little bit and we'll say, so what was the favorite project that you worked on while you were there?
Thrycreen, the Thrycreen Lapis book. It was, although there were a lot of things that I loved working on, but the Thrycreen book was my favorite.
Okay, how come?
I had been playing Thrycreen in a campaign that Thomas Reed was running, and Rich Baker and a handful of the others, Colin McComb, was playing. And it just was such a good experience. And then to be able to be handed a player character species and be given pretty much free reign to develop it from the stuff that had gone before. That was just fantastic. And I ended up looking at a lot of the artwork that had come early on in the Thrycreen, and I worked with a great artist, John Dollar, and he every Thrycreen that had been done up to that point was a different style, and some of them just radically different. And so what I did when I was designing the Thrycreen book was each art style became a different subspecies. And they were named for the artist. So the Jazz was Jeff Easley's, and the Jahal was Jim Holloway's, and the Geral was Gerald Brom, and Tuxah was Tom Baxa. And then I named one after my friend Tony DiTerlizzi, because he'd sent me reference art that John and I used. And so one was the Tondi, and one was named after myself using the middle part of my middle name, Michael. So it became Tikich.
Wow. Okay. So it's interesting that like recently I've heard that like Wizards is not going to revisit the Dark Sun world. What do you think of that?
I think it's a valid decision, but I also think it's a little bit of a shame. I get why they're doing it, because the Dark Sun setting does have a heavy element of slavery and class division and so forth. And you certainly don't want to glorify that. But I think being realistic about things that have happened in our own history is valid too. A lot of my current writings take place in a parallel Earth. So I'm drawing from a lot of real history. And I don't want to whitewash the bad events. I don't want to say this never happened in my universe. But what I do want to say is that there were consequences for it. So that's my version of a better world, is that bad things still happen, but there are consequences for that, for the bad people. So I think there is a way to do Dark Sun that is both respectful and recognizes real world history. But it's a fine line to tread, and if they don't want to tread that, I totally get it.
No, and I agree. I mean, that was something that like with Paizo saying, nope, we're completely taking it out of the game. I mean, yes, slavery is absolutely a sensitive subject, but especially in games about being heroes, why are you trying to, like, you don't necessarily want to glorify it, but why not leave it as an option for, hey, this is something for the for players to be heroic,
right? Right. And I think part of the problem that comes into it, which is not part of Dark Sun, because in Dark Sun the slavers could have been of any species or subspecies, and likewise the slaves could have been of any type of being. But so many times in fantasy we see a specific species like orcs take slaves, or drow elves take slaves, or things like that. And that is problematic when you're identifying a race or species or subspecies as the bad guy. And a lot of times those tropes come from inherent racism and systemic racism. So saying that orcs are evil and they hold slaves, well, that is bad, because then that is just casting them as the other. And that's where you want to draw the line. I think you don't want to cast somebody as the other. You just want to, if you're talking about slavery in the game, you want it obvious that the bad guys are bad because they're holding slaves.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's how I would run it personally, right. Because I mean, well, okay, let's be honest. I don't really run games because I'm bad at all of this, but that's a separate story. But were I to run it, yes, that's the approach that I would take. And I think a lot of people would. Right. So I just thought it was kind of curious because, or the main reason I brought it up was just because that was one of the settings that you were most proud of having worked on. So I figured and it was a relevant question. Anyways.
It is, absolutely.
So then one other question I would ask is, what do you think was your most challenging product to work on while you were at TSR?
That's a good question.
I didn't prepare it, so don't give me too much credit. This is all on the fly.
I think Spellfire was probably the bigger challenge, simply because, well, yeah, Spellfire was probably the biggest challenge because I got the assignment.
That was the card game, right?
That was the card game.
Okay.
And I had not really worked on a card game before. And so I was assigned to create 2 decks for it and also write the book on it, a portion of the book on it that would talk about the cards and what's good for different things, stuff like that. So it was a really different mindset. But the way it worked out was that my official assignment was to create the decks, and my freelance assignment, because at the time they were allowing us to do freelance within the company, my freelance assignment was to work on the book. So I was drowning in Spellfire for a couple of months, to the point where I dreamt a variation of the card game. So in the dream, I was explaining to somebody how Spellfire worked, and I didn't have any Spellfire cards. So in the dream, I picked up a deck of regular playing cards, and I proceeded to explain how they could be used to play Spellfire. And as I woke up, I realized that it worked. And so I kind of fleshed out the idea while I was showering and on the way to work. And when I got there, I wrote it down real quick and then play tested it at lunch. And so a Spellfire deck was 55 cards. And the only deck of regular playing cards I had that was 55 cards was a deck with the back for Magic the Gathering, which of course was not to be seen around TSR if you were wise.
Okay, real quick, why?
Just because it was seen as such a competitor. And that was kind of fascinating to me too. We had gone from about no more than a year long of saying, seeing an announcement that Palladium was suing Wizards of the Coast and thinking, man, why is Palladium going after poor little Wizards of the Coast, to suddenly Magic the Gathering hits and they're booming. And I mean, they started the whole collectible card game thing.
Right.
And Spellfire was TSR's entry. So yeah, it was not wise to be seen endorsing the enemy's product, which is exactly what happened when Jim Ward walked in during that lunch. So even though it worked to be able to play Spellfire with playing cards, it absolutely went nowhere.
But it might have been tainted a little bit. But,
yes.
No, so and actually you also brought up something kind of interesting where you said you had regular work but then freelance work.
Mm-hmm.
So was that like, okay, doing your regular work, that's your salary job,
right?
But then like if you wanted a quote unquote bonus this month, then you could pitch it like, oh, here's again 2 monsters and a sidebar to throw in that thing, and I get $100 this week or something.
Right.
Oh.
You could write for Dragon Magazine or Dungeon Magazine, and occasionally they would open it up to say, okay, we don't have an assigned author for this adventure. We'll offer it first to the in-house designers if they've got enough time, and then if they don't, then we'll go outside and get an outside designer. So there were periods of time when that happened a lot at TSR.
Oh, okay. That was, I mean, I find that, I actually find that really interesting. Like me, I have a degree in business. And so like anything with like I love games, but I also love that business side of, like, and I find that absolutely fascinating. It's like, I'm already paying you,
mm-hmm.
but then you also get these freelance credits, at the same, anyways, okay. Sorry. I just got fully fully distracted on that.
That's okay. The advantage to it was that the in-house designers and editors theoretically knew everything that they were supposed to do. And for the
Right.
most part, we did. You know?
Theoretically.
Right. Whereas sometimes you would get an outside designer or editor who didn't quite get the style. And there was a joke about the 3-check editing method, which was spell check, grammar check, paycheck.
Fair enough. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, all right. So then after a few years, you decided that, you know, it was time to move on from TSR. And how come?
Well, having come from the RPGA, they knew what I was making for a salary there, which by today's standards is just ridiculously low. And even at the time, it wasn't that great, although it was better than a lot of places. And so when I switched over to design, I was not even close to what the other designers were making. And so that was kind of, under my skin a little bit. And then the opportunity came up to interview with Wizards of the Coast, and
the enemy. No,
yeah. And there were a handful of us that went on this interview. I think I want to say 6 of us altogether. There was myself, Wolfgang Bauer, Mike Selinker, Taywin Woodruff, and then a couple people that had worked in the tournament side of things, John Ceriso and Marshall Simpson. And we flew out to Seattle as a group and interviewed, and they made offers to the creative part of that, not to the convention organizing part of it, which was unfortunate. But I accepted, and Wolf followed me a little bit later, and Mike followed me a little bit after that. And Taywin was somewhere in there. I don't remember whether she was 3rd or 4th, something like that. But and it doubled my salary. And
wow.
And I was the first TSR game designer hired by Wizards of the Coast. And 6 months later, I was the first one laid off.
Oh no!
6 months later, I was working on, and our group was working on the 2nd or 3rd attempt to make a Magic the Gathering role-playing game. That was what we were hired for. And 6 months in, we had a managers meeting that I was at where Peter Adkison, president of Wizards at the time, said the Magic role-playing game is a priority for this company. And then a week later at an all-hands meeting, he said a bunch of things, but the thing that stood out was, we're not really sure that this whole role-playing thing is a core strength for the company. And business-wise, he was probably right. And what they ended up doing then was laying most of us off. A couple people were able to transition to other groups, and then purchase TSR to get the core strength for role-playing games. So business-wise, I get it.
Sure. But I mean, that's also kind of interesting that they would hire you and then lay you off and then just buy the company that they had hired you from. Mm-hmm. And not just keep you there and just slot everything back together.
Yeah. Well, it was a lot of growing pains. At the time, people within Wizards were talking about a number of employees. I would hear occasionally something like, well, we have 150 employees now. In 6 months, we'll be at 200. In a year, we'll be at 300. And I started thinking, what are those people going to be doing? Because I was also looking at the magazine department at TSR, which had about 5 people, 6, I think, if you counted the person that handled subscriptions. And they were putting out at TSR Dragon Magazine every month, Dungeon Magazine every other month, and the Polyhedron Newsine and Amazing Stories, and just, putting out a lot of content. And meantime, at Wizards, they had 9 people who were struggling to get a magazine out every month or two. So it was a lot of growing pains, and they had gotten so much money at first that they had unfortunately gotten in the habit of throwing bodies at a problem, which is not sustainable.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so then, all right. So we've already gone a little over an hour, but I'm still really like your story is. I like knowing people's stories. So, let's see. From the now I got distracted by a question from the hill. He says the cover for Wizards Challenge always stood out to me. The look of horror on that unicorn's face as the wizard turned it into a dragon. What is going on there?
I have no idea.
Me neither.
That was a piece of art that was attached to that adventure before I was.
Fair enough.
And that happened occasionally, where the cover art would already be assigned, and I most of the time, if I could, I tried to work it into the adventure. Like when I did Flint's Axe, there was a piece of art that was done. And there's another story, but I'll skip that one. But I worked.
We'll have to have you back on to tell that story.
and I made a new monster for it, to describe what that was, because what it was supposed to be, it didn't quite fit. So I made myself the monster expert at TSR. Everything that came out in the Monstrous Compendium loose leaf format, whether it was actually loose leaf or in a magazine or whatever, I collected them, and I had like an 8-volume set of all the monsters that had been published in that format, which is why I ended up doing the Monstrous Manual.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I was slightly distracted. That is not what I wanted to do. Okay, so then you get laid off from Wizards of the Coast. What happens to your game design from there?
We had never really gotten it off the ground. So we became the second or third of 4 or 5 attempts. And at one point, Wizards made the decision that they wanted to keep the 2 lines, Magic the Gathering and D&D, completely separate for brand identity, until that was reversed, within the last 2 or 3 years, where they started publishing D&D versions of some of the Magic worlds and vice versa, putting D&D characters in the Magic cards. So,
which, as far as I'm not so sure about the D&D characters into the Magic cards, but as far as like not making campaign settings for Magic worlds, like never made any sense to me. Like when they're like, "Oh, here's a Ravnica book," I was like, "Really? 20 years later?"
Right. And I was in my time at Wizards. We were discussing the primary world, Dominaria, as the setting for the role-playing game, or as we were calling it, the adventure game. MTAG was what we were calling it, Magic the Adventure Game. And it was just a fascinating world to me, with the Hurloon Minotaurs and the Sarah Angels and so many really interesting characters and peoples. Really appealed to the history major in me.
Sure. But obviously the M tag failed, but then once you left once you left Wizards, did you go to another game company, or did you finally decide, okay, no, it's time for me to get a real job and I'll just keep doing this on the side?
Yes to both.
Okay.
I tried my hand at freelance, and that was around the time that I worked for Pinnacle on Deadlands with the Rascals, Varmints, and Critters book. So I did some freelance. For them, I worked on some of the Hercules and Xena role-playing game for West End Games. A little bit of this, but I eventually determined that I don't have what I think of as the freelancer gene.
Manage your own schedule, your own business.
Yeah, I look at some of the really good freelancers, and it seems like they always have at least 3 projects going, and they're working on getting the next 6. And I really prefer to concentrate on something, and if it needs revisions, I want to be able to make revisions. And so I can do freelance, especially if it's the right sort of project. I've done freelance editing on the English version of The Dark Eye, and a number of other things, but it has to be the right fit for me, or I'm going to fail at it, quite frankly. So
fair enough. So okay, so I do want to transition over to Start Here, but before we do that, one question that I can't believe I haven't asked yet.
Okay.
What games do you play?
Anymore, it is mostly Start Here. It's been that way for about the last 3 years. But I enjoy playing different versions of D&D. I really have a fondness for 3rd edition, especially because to me, it cleaned up a lot of the things that didn't quite fit in 2nd edition. And I've played a little bit of 5th edition, and it's fine. And I've never quite played 4th edition. I think it's a fine game. It just doesn't strike me as truly being D&D. I also I've played some Pathfinder, Deadlands. I've had ongoing Deadlands campaigns off and on over the years. And I really enjoyed playing at Gen Con the last couple of years. We did the 5th edition version, or 5th edition compatible versions of Stargate and Everyday Heroes, which is the modern 5th edition, and is a wonderful little system.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen Everyday Heroes. I'll be honest, I've kind of backed off from D&D. The funny thing is, the first one that I really played was 3rd edition. And is where I actually have most of my chops, and I'm pushing 50 years old. So okay, but yeah, no, it's so obviously you've played a bunch of different stuff, but like you said, most of what you've been playing the last few years has been Start Here. So I'm actually going to if I can figure out how to do this. There we go. All right.
Awesome.
So this is a Kickstarter for Start Here.
Right.
Why don't you tell us what this is?
Okay. Well, Start Here is the D20 system stripped down to its bare essence. Like I said earlier, and I don't remember if we were live at the time or not, but I've just gotten kind of tired of the thick, expensive rule book that makes you feel like you have to complete coursework before you can play. I just think it should be a lot simpler than that, a lot easier than that. And so looking around, there are the introductory sets for the various complicated games, but usually they're just giving you less of that more complicated game. and then there's the introductory kids games, which I think also are fine. There's some very good ones out there, but I didn't want to focus just on kids. I wanted something that kids and adults could play. And there was a niche available, and it took a long time to name the game. But what the scenario I pictured in my head was that somebody goes into a game store and they see the giant wall of games and they say, "Oh my God, where do I start?" I'll start here.
Okay, first off, from a marketing perspective, that's brilliant. Well, and I say that partly because, like, so I talk about how D&D 3rd edition was the first time I really played, but it wasn't the first thing I ever looked at.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I looked at like, it was before 3rd edition came out. I'm like, well, maybe I should give D&D a try. And I picked up a player's handbook, and so it's like, well, it's the player's handbook. This is going to tell me what to do. And it just says, make a character.
Yeah.
Why? Why would I do this?
Right.
So like, having something that just says, hey, start here. So what is it that, besides just being, we'll call it D20, just stripped down to its bare essence, what is it that makes this a place that somebody should start with role playing?
Okay. Well, it does what a lot of games have done over the years, which is to explain what a role-playing game is, and talks about playing the hero and going on adventures and creating stories with your friends. So that's one of the places that you start, is the understanding of what you're actually doing in this game. And then from there, it offers a few choices. And there will be included a number of pre-generated characters. So if you don't quite know what you're doing, but you think, hey, I might want to play a warrior, or hey, I might want to play a mage, then there will be several characters available that you can choose from. And it'll talk about the tropes and what those characters do and how they're different, and describe the ability scores, just everything from the ground up. And then you get to the rules, which is, I mean, there's really only one rule. If you want to take an action, you make an action roll. That means you roll the 20-sided die and you add the ability score that's appropriate for the action. The number you're trying to beat is the other side's target number, which is usually 10 plus their ability score, the average. And that's it. I mean, there's some tweaks to exactly how that rule works, but I mean, I don't have a lot of rules. That's it.
Okay. So now then let's start getting into some of the details. So, okay. Is it like your typical class race kind of, or species kind of situation, or is it more freeform, say like a Savage Worlds or Shadowrun?
It is okay. So, well, first let me mention that there's a beginner's book and an experienced player's book, because I released a version of this game about 10 years ago in PDF form. And I realized as soon as I did that I hit very squarely between those two markets, one being completely new players and the other one being experienced people who want to teach new players. And so part of this game came from splitting those rules into those two versions. So there's a beginning player's book and an experienced player's book, which
almost kind of like a basic expert.
Kind of,
yeah. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
That's all right. And I also tend to think of them as a student version and the teacher's version. So in the beginner's book, you have a choice of 4 archetypes, is what I call them: warrior, rogue, mage, and believer. Believer is my version of a cleric. I just didn't want to limit the believer to a religion. If somebody wanted to believe, as a guy at Gen Con said, he had a cleric that believed in the power of friendship, and I thought that was perfect for what I want to do. If you, whatever you want to believe in, an ethos or a principle or nature or whatever it is, you can have that, and you can gain these powers from it. So the archetypes are there. Very limited choice. Part of simplifying is taking away choice. And part of it's taking away the need for choice. So the 6 basic species that I have are human, elf, dwarf, and what I'm calling florin, which covers halflings and gnomes and kender and hobbits.
Something below waist height.
And then minotaurs, and a species that I call the troon, which is an evolved dinosaur. So it kind of fills in the lizard man, although they're really closer to birds, but whatever.
I have chickens. I totally understand.
Yes. So those are the 6 basic species, but how you want to play them is completely up to you. There is a section where I talk about how a stereotypical elf is considered graceful and charismatic, but you don't have to play it that way. You can play an elf who is strong. I've got one of the player characters in my playtest campaign now is an extremely strong florin, because that's what she wanted to play.
Okay.
And so it's that end of it is free form. I considered having species advantages and disadvantages like we see in most forms of D&D and so forth, and I just thought, no, that's just kind of playing into the it kind of plays into the bigotry that you see in some of the older versions of it. And yes, the florin does hold into, it does cover hobbits as well. So yeah, you're good.
Okay, so if you, I mean, that's one thing that I would ask. I mean, there's obviously a bunch of debate on that, but if there's nothing built into the species to differentiate them outside of saying, oh, I'm a florin, I'm an elf, I'm a dwarf. What is it that makes it a reason to take that choice?
Personal preference, and isn't that the way real life is?
I mean, it can be sometimes.
Yeah, or you're stuck with what you got genetically at birth, and it doesn't make you any better or worse than someone else, just different.
Okay. So no, I partly asked that because I don't know. I personally I like a little bit of differentiation, because otherwise it's just to me it's just a different it's just a different human.
Yeah.
Which is like,
and in fact I say that in the rules that elves and dwarves and florins are just different branches on the human family tree, and for that matter so are minotaurs, but they're just a little farther off.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. So all right, so then you start with the basic book. And is there stuff in the book to say teach someone how to be a game master?
Yes. So the beginner's book is projected to be 64 pages. About half of that is the Serpents and Strongholds campaign setting and adventures. And then the other half is devoted to rules. But like I said, I just don't have that many rules. So once I get past between 4 and 8 pages with some long explanations and examples, the rest of that 32 pages is left for guidance for the GM. And we felt like that was very important to not just introduce new players, but new GMs as well, because somebody has to run the game if you pick it up. And you can't always rely on, like I couldn't. I didn't have an experienced player to be the GM, so I became the GM. So I envision this as a new player being able to pick it up and saying, well, I can run this. And that is an important goal for me, that we teach people how to run games as well. So it's another way to get new gamers in.
Okay. Then so what is it in so you've got the basic book, and then you've got I believe you called it experience, not expert, obviously.
Right.
So what changes does the experienced book add to the game?
The experienced players book, first of all, it concentrates more on rules and less on examples, because we assume that you're experienced either from playing the beginner's game or from playing another game. So fewer examples, more just concentrating on the rules. Another sample campaign setting in that book, the Star Explorer setting. And then it takes a sort of a modular approach, is how I'm thinking of it, so that if you want to add more magic, you can do that, and you have a selection of spells. And I still haven't quite decided what I'm calling them for believers. I'm leaning towards rituals, but I'm not set on that yet. And then more weapons for the warriors, more things that a rogue can do. And so magic is a component, other skills, and either feats or advantages. I haven't decided completely on what I'm going to call them. I'm leaning towards advantages because it's just a more generic term. But it would include things like, the advantages would be things like low light vision, which rather than getting because you happen to be an elf or a dwarf, you would have low light vision because you're used to operating in the dark, whatever you are. and things like that. Skills, a little more division of the ability scores into individual skills. And then the big thing that comes in the experienced players book is the advancement system, which for many years, actually since before I was working on the Magic Adventure game, I've envisioned a game that has primarily a skill advancement system, like Deadlands or Shadowrun or things like that, but a level-based fallback, so that if you want to build a character from scratch, you can do that. And if you want to say, well, I just want to be a warrior, you can do that. Or from the GM's perspective, if you want to say, I need a 5th level warrior, it's right there for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Real quick, as far as the quote unquote magic system for the believers, I'll toss out a word for you.
Okay.
Ordinances. That
okay.
Maybe not the best one. I'm just giving you another one to think on.
I will add it to the increasing list.
Okay. If you use it, I get my and credit. No.
Okay. Levers developed by Tim Beach and Brian Wade.
I do not need an and credit. That is, anyway. I'm sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm a disaster. Sorry about that.
No worries.
No, and I actually kind of like how you're doing that. It seems like the experience book is more about adding in modules as opposed to this is now a brand new way to play. It's like, okay, right. So if you want to, you have your starting your start here book, mm-hmm. and then you have, oh, okay, so if you want to make your magic user a little better, or do something a little different with your warrior, here are things that you can add to it. But it's not really changing the game, at least from the way I understand it.
Right, and that is something else that's very important to me. I've seen D&D do this any number of times, and Pathfinder has done it once. And if you talk about other games like Shadowrun, then they reach a point where they either have so much stuff or they've gotten kind of scattered, and they burn it to the ground and they start over. And so that's where we get to 5th edition now D&D, and 2nd edition Pathfinder. And I don't ever want to do that. I don't want to ever issue another edition of the rules. I mean, more spells, more monsters, more stuff, but I don't ever want to change the rules. That is my goal.
Yeah, and I can see that. I mean, like, you hear, like, I caught something online the other day of somebody talking about how they were celebrating the 44th anniversary of their AD&D campaign. And it's just like, and specifically mentioning, this is still just the 1st edition rules. I mean, I can understand getting to a point where, okay, this rule didn't quite work. Can we do this better? Nobody's using that rule. But especially if you're keeping the rules as a very basic, and then, okay, here are modules that you can use alternatively.
Or in addition to,
right, yeah, that's more what I meant. It makes it something that can be a little bit more long lasting, a little bit more enduring.
Right.
And I love being able to do this again. From the Hilt says, you said it, Tim. Take what's good and run with it. Let's just play the game and not worry about the rules so much.
Yeah.
So,
and when I run a game at a convention or I show somebody a demo, I'll spend maybe 5 minutes demonstrating this is how the rule works. This is how combat works, so we get it out of the way. And now just let's get on with the story. Let's play.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that's like, again, going back to the story that everyone here has probably now heard thousands of times, the peanut gallery included. That first game of D&D that I went to, it was I made a ninja,
right,
and then never played. So the faster somebody can get in, beyond just, oh, hey, here's a pre-generated character that you can use.
And character generation for my system, you've got the 6 ability scores: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. I stuck with the what's become the classics. And character generation is you start with a 4 in each of those scores. You have 13 points to add wherever you want to, nothing higher than a 9.
Okay.
What's unless you're really indecisive, 10 minutes.
So if none of your ability scores can have higher than a 9, what's the range on an ability score?
1 to 10. When in the beginner book, scores can go up to 9. When you become first level in the experienced player's book, you gain 1 point to add wherever you want to.
Okay, so the beginner book is more, we'll say like a Dungeon Crawl Classics kind of zero level
characters. Yeah. Although I don't really make a big deal of that, but yeah, they're basically 0 level characters.
Okay, no, I mean that's fine. I mean, they're like, especially if you're starting with some sort of a basic story.
Yeah. Yeah, and you got to start somewhere, like here.
Yeah. I mean, I like starting here. It's a good place to start.
Yes.
Or no, let me rephrase that. I like to start here. There we go. There. See, okay, that's keeping the name intact. There we go. Yes. So then So me personally, I backed the campaign at the $25 level.
Right.
So really quick, everyone, there is a link in the description. He needs $663. I'm not saying any one of you needs to do it yourself, but I mean, for me, I'm doing this bundle, $25, and I get all 3 books digitally. Okay. So the first one at 64 pages, the second one at 96 pages. Now, you said the first one does come with a campaign setting. The second book also does?
Right. So the beginning player's book starts with the Serpents and Strongholds, the fantasy setting. It's kind of based on that meme that says, for a game called Dungeons and Dragons, it doesn't seem to have a lot of either. Well, Serpents and Strongholds has a ton of both. And then the setting for the experienced player's book is the science fantasy game where you have starships that are basically run by Magitech. Everything that you see in Star Trek that looks like magic, like transporters and tractor beams, those actually are magic in Star X.
Okay.
And then the campaign sampler will expand on both of those, the Serpents and Strongholds in Star X, and then it adds 2 more, Wizards and Wranglers, which is the Old West with magic and elves and dragons, and then the Zombiesaurus Rex setting, which is where scientists decided to bring back dinosaurs, and they used a modified zombie virus, and something went wrong. I don't know who could have predicted
that. Zombie virus went horribly sideways.
Right.
That's weird. So does book 3 give you additional rules like the experience book, or is it just campaign settings?
I mean, there would be some campaign specific things, like how zombies work. Like I've decided that zombies have gingivitis. That is the primary spread of the zombie virus.
I'm feeling called out, Tim. No.
But I got to thinking, so my day job is I work in a factory, and if my production line is running poorly, then I have a puzzle to solve, which is awesome for me. And if it is running very well, then I get to work on my games, and my supervisors know that. If they see me scribbling notes, that's what I'm doing. I mean,
that's the breath weapon, not the bite weapon.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Sorry.
So, yeah, and the other thing about Zombiesaurus Rex is that you can fight zombies using music.
Okay. How so?
Well, when the scientists modified the zombie virus, they wanted to put something in so that they could control the dinosaurs. So they put in sort of an audio backdoor to it, which sticks with the zombies that come from this particular version of the virus.
Oh, okay.
But basically, you can either use it with magic, or I've come up with now, I think I have the system for just using regular music against the zombies. And it involves attacking with charisma instead of strength, for example, or dexterity, and building from there. But again, all follows the same basic rule.
Okay. So I mean, that, like, all of this, just like, first off, these are all just fun ideas. I like the sound of all of this. But one thing I would ask, and obviously, I mean, you're just getting started, you're wanting to get this funded. But are you planning on making ways for the community to be involved? Like, not necessarily an OGL or like specific license, or maybe it is something like that. I don't know.
Well, I sure hope so. I've talked to Brian Lewis and a couple of the other people that are involved with the Orc license. Yes, I'll have to tell you about some of the Zombiesaurus Rex sample characters.
Tenacious Rex and the no, I can't make a horrible joke off of that one. But anyway, sorry.
So I lost track of my thought. But
OGL.
yes, OGL and the Orc license. So I'll do something like that. And also, I hope to get the system played, whether it's me running it or somebody else running it, at a lot of conventions, including Gen Con, because I really do think it's just the good way to bring in new players. It's just so easy.
Yeah, no, I mean, like obviously that's one of the key limiters is getting people to actually play the game.
Right.
I know that like it's one of the things that between like the way that I've heard the story, like, you know, D&D was kind of collapsing towards the end of second edition, and the OGL brought many more people back into the hobby in the first place.
Right.
But to me, I remember watching it at the time, and I also think that it had the downside of sort of killing the hobby, because I remember going and you would see Palladium and D&D and Shadowrun and all these different games and people trying different things, but then suddenly everything was D20.
Yeah. Yeah, even there was a Deadlands D20 version, and you know, the World of Darkness D20 version, and so many of the others. And you're right. The good thing, in my opinion, is that it gave kind of a universal system that was the shared consciousness. And I think that's good. That if you pick up one of those games and you've played one of the other ones, then you know pretty well how it's going to work, which I do think is a good thing. The bad thing, like you said, is that there aren't as many non-D20 choices as there used to be. There's some very good ones, both Moneycook's Cipher system and Green Ronin's Age system, both very good. And I haven't delved into Kobold Press's Black Sails yet, but I've got good hopes for that too. There's some excellent systems out there, but it is a little harder to get noticed now when there's so much expectation for D20, which, I mean, quite honestly, I'm leaning into.
Right.
So I can't argue with it too much. But I think that my system is good to get somebody used to the idea of how to play a role-playing game. And in that sense, it stays universal too. It's not just how to play and some of the common things that you're going to see in any role-playing game, but also how to run a game and how to think about the challenges for your players and that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, and I completely agree. And I think, you know, getting people at conventions or you know, maybe later on down the road, I can have you come in and we can do a live one shot on stream or something.
Sure, yeah.
That's something that I've been experimenting with. The guys that I hang out with on Wednesdays for the Four Colored Cafe, we ended up doing a live stream one time for one of the contributors. He's written a few games, so we did that. So anyways, that's a possibility. I'm happy to help promote it that way.
My playtest campaign is a Zoom game, and I have players in Australia, the Midwest, and New York. So
yeah. Okay. So then like, again, provided that we get you funding for this, right. Where is it that you'd like to see Start Here go?
Well, one of the things about getting funding is I think it's really important to get the game into stores. You know, beginning players aren't going to help a Kickstarter. And that's, easy enough to
Right.
see that that's a niche, and they aren't, they, for the most part, aren't aware of Kickstarter's existence even. But what I would like to do for my continued existence is the campaign worlds. Like I said, I had a version of this game out about 10 years ago, hit squarely between the two versions that I wanted it to be. But when I sat down to split it into those two versions, the beginners and the experienced players, it seemed like for the first year to 2 years, every time I sat down to do that, I came up with another campaign setting. So I have 23 of them. And and most of them are on a continuous history for one parallel Earth. A couple of them are on a different one, and they're scattered off. But if I could tell those stories and set up worlds for people to play in for the rest of my life, that would make me happy. The other thing I want to avoid, though, is the escalation that we see, especially with World of Darkness, and we're beginning to see it in like 5th edition and some of the other games, where a book comes out and then a next book comes out, and everything in the new book is so much cooler that people forget about the original book. Or the World of Darkness example, you have vampires. Vampires, cool. Then you have werewolves, and werewolves are more powerful than vampires. And then you have mages, and mages are more powerful than werewolves and vampires. And it's just this sort of escalation. But the sample characters that I have for even these initial 4 settings, from the Old West to science fiction to fantasy to kind of wacky horror, they're all very compatible. So you could have those, and that's the basis of my playtest campaign, is that I have characters from 6 or 8 different settings, to make sure that they can work together, so that I don't have that escalation. So,
Okay. No, well, and come on, Tim, you do have to admit you skipped over the easy one as far as that goes.
which one?
Rifts.
Oh, right, yes.
Which I will admit, I'm a big fan of Rifts, but yeah, the power creep is on a whole different level there.
It is. It really is. I love the concept, but man.
Yeah, no, and that's the one that like so the first role-playing game that I ever picked up was the Robotech role-playing game.
Okay.
Because I was a kid in the 80s and loved Robotech, so that was the first thing that hooked me.
Yeah.
And then I found out about Rifts, and I was a teenage boy, so I mean, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But anyhow, so but no, so that's actually kind of a question that just came to my mind. So as a designer, how do you prevent that power creep? If you're wanting to come up with these settings and give people like, oh, here's a cool option, but how do you design it so that they're not necessarily dumping everything that they've done, but still making those new options?
Right. So there is this impulse in role-playing gamers to want their characters to do cool stuff. And I think the answer is that you're able to do cool stuff in whatever setting you're in. It's just, different cool stuff. But everybody's going to be drawing from the same initial set of spells, the same initial weapons. There are a couple of higher powered weapons, but I'm going to try to put that across the board, so that there are powerful weapons and magic in Wizards and Wranglers, and there's powerful weapons and magic in Star X. So as your characters grow and become more experienced, chances are that some of them will find, the bazooka or the fireball or whatever it is. But I think as long as that's available in all the settings, you shouldn't see the power creep. And I'm not saying that, in an individual game, you won't have it because that is something that the GM is going to have to control a little better. I have to watch it in my playtest campaign.
Right.
But I also don't want to shut off and say, well, there are no bazookas in this setting, because that doesn't make sense either, especially if you're fighting zombie dinosaurs.
Right.
But they all do go back to the same system, which I guess maybe I should talk about combat just real briefly. Any attack that you make in combat is based on dexterity. It's a dexterity action roll. Roll the 20-sided die, add your dexterity. If you beat the target number, which is 10 plus their dexterity, you hit. And the way that area of effect spells or area of effect damage or massive damage works is that in an area of effect spell or explosion, then you get an attack on everybody in that area. And in the high-powered spells or high-powered weapons, you get multiple attacks on the same individual. And I think that's going to... There will be an escalation of cooler weapons or cooler spells, but as long as I don't let that get out of hand, I think I'm in good shape. And that's one of the things that I'm working on in the experience book, is to make sure it doesn't get out of hand.
Okay. Then another thing I meant to ask, and I think you've mentioned it. So there is a level system for the characters, correct?
Correct. In the experienced player's book.
Okay. What's the level range?
I'm dealing with it in terms of levels 1 through 20, or 0 through 20, I guess, if you want to look at it that way.
Okay. And so then how are you dealing with the power scaling between levels 1 through 20? Like,
carefully is the answer. There's going to be a point in a combat where one side and the two sides are going to be swinging and missing and swinging and missing and hitting and not doing damage, or hitting and doing damage. And I think there's a point at which those combats will become longer than people necessarily want to play. But at that point, maybe it is time to switch over to one of the more complex systems that has hit points, that has a solid end. Because in mine, if you hit somebody, they have a chance to resist the damage rating of the weapon or spell. If they don't resist it, they lose a point of strength. And if you get to 0 strength, then you can't move. You have no strength. And then it's up to the other side to decide what they want to do with you. And that's where I make lethality optional in the game. Which I always say that's because I want kids to play, but then I think of the bloodthirsty 6-year-olds I've seen.
I have 3 boys. They haven't grown out of it. So then, and actually that's one thing that I just remembered. There is a question from Mitzi, which I'm guessing she probably is involved in this somehow.
Yes.
Okay. But before I get to her question, so what, like, is there character death in the game, or
I mean, there can be. I don't want to force it on anybody. I do want lethality to be an option. So if you're playing with a group and your monsters overpower them and they take away everybody's strength, then as a GM, you have the choice of capturing them or taking away their stuff or whatever it is. So you don't have to choose lethality. But yes, there is character death. If your constitution is your life, if you hit 0 constitution, the character's dead.
Okay, so then what's the difference between taking damage through strength and taking damage through constitution?
It takes different things to initially damage Constitution. Things like electricity or fire or poison will damage Constitution directly. And if you choose to keep attacking after somebody is out of strength, then the points come off of Constitution. So that's kind of the way it goes. You're hitting a paralyzed victim basically over and over again until you kill them. And then that becomes maybe a moral discussion of, are you sure you really want to do that?
Sure.
So, but that's up to the GM and the style that they want to play with. I hope GMs will do that and make their players think a little bit before they just randomly kill people and become murder hobos.
Sure. Well, I mean, come on. Who doesn't want to be a murder hobo? I mean,
occasionally it is fun.
That's fair. So Mitzi would like to know, she says, ask about his playtesters' characters suddenly finding out new things about their characters that even they didn't know.
Yes, Mitzi is a very long-time friend of mine, and she was my college girlfriend when I was getting into the RPGA and Gen Con and so forth, and we've remained friends. And she plays one of the characters in the game, and her character is one that I have on my business cards. My business cards and my flyers for the Kickstarter all have sample characters on them. Because again, that's a good way to show how simple the game is, because here's a sample character on the inside of my business card.
That's awesome.
But so Mitzi wanted to play a character that she said was a foundling, was found by a wagon train in the Wizards and Wranglers setting, and picked up and adopted. And she also talked about how she wanted the character to have some very good disguise abilities, which were borderline shape-shifting. And I asked, well, do you want the shape-shifting to be more based on an item, or do you want it to be inherent? And she said inherent. And I said, well, obviously, to myself, I said this, obviously that character is Fae. And it's a Fae changeling that they found. But she didn't find that out for several adventures.
All right. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry. Someone was asking, like, someone just came into the stream, and he's like, "Wait, who are we talking to?" I'm like, "Well, we're talking with Tim." Who's Tim? It's like, all ones. I'm sorry, you're gonna have to go back and watch the beginning of the stream, and you'll get to know all about Tim. Well, at least what he's willing to tell us.
Right. I mean, I'm pretty open.
We haven't gotten the bank account out of him yet. That'll probably be the next stream. But no, I'm sorry. I make horrible jokes. It's all I've got. So awesome. Well, no, and that is kind of fantastic, especially like when I mean, that is one of just the fun things about these games. You can do those kinds of things. And especially if you've got a good GM, you're like, oh, you want this? Yeah, this is going to be fun.
Yeah, and I think that's an idea that I want to try to get across in the GM's advice for the book. That is honestly one of the parts that I'm struggling with a little bit, is the advice of try not to say no, and try to get ideas from your players. I play with kids from time to time in the games, and sometimes it's mixed kids and adults. Sometimes I've had just a couple of groups of kids, but some of them are just the most weirdly creative people, and they say something and I don't want to say no. So I was doing a Wizards and Wranglers scenario because it's a good test game, because it's got you say Wizards and Wranglers and people know pretty instantaneously what they're going to be playing.
Sure.
Cowboys and magic. So um, stuff like that. And and this one child said, well, I want to play a 21st century video game kid player. Like, all right, give me a second to think about that. But once I got the character relocated to that area, because the other player in that game wanted to be a demon, and with a cute demon, because anime.
As a child does.
Right. And so if you have a demon, then you can have time travel, at least limited. So why not? That gets them there. And then the power that I gave them was I gave the character a controller, a video game controller that could affect reality. And so that's how I integrated into the game. I gave them a different kind of magic, as it were.
Sure. So now, first off, all ones threw in a $20 super chat. Thank you very much, all ones. I do appreciate that. But he does say a good GM needs to know when to say no. So as a counterpoint, what would you say for when you run a game? What is it that makes you say no to a player as opposed to trying to work with what they want to do?
So there's a handful of things. The main things are anything that completely breaks physics. I mean, we have magic to break physics to an extent. But one of the cautions I put in the rule is that if you roll the action roll and you beat the target number, you succeed, as long as the action is possible. And the example I give is a normal human can't jump across the Grand Canyon, no matter how good they roll. And the other things are something that breaks the game, because we all, when we're playing a game together, we kind of make a contract with each other that we are at least going to try to work together. We might have conflicts a little bit, but for the most part, we're going to figure things out and we're going to work together. So there's the social contract, and you don't want to break the social contract so that your character is kind of running roughshod over the other characters. Anytime that a player is damaging somebody else's fun, that's when you have to say no.
Okay.
And beyond that, there are going to be some things, some subjects that we just don't want to touch on. And that's, again, dependent on the player and the GMs, that they might have some subjects that they don't want to talk about, that they don't want to see in the game. And it's good to know that up front, to say that, okay, we aren't going to talk about anything where animals are harmed, or whatever it is that might cause them, anguish. So there's places, you're absolutely right. There are times when a DM has to say no, but those are kind of the main ones, the ones that break physics too much, the ones that harm other players, the ones that take the adventure off into a complete tangent that the GM isn't prepared for. It's legitimate to say, no, you can't go that direction. And I would finish it with, because I haven't figured out what's there yet.
Okay.
I would just be completely honest. I don't know what's there yet, so you can't go there yet. Give me a week. We'll talk about it.
Of course, isn't that the time for a nice random table to show up?
That's there is some advantages to that, yes. Rolling the wondering damage table.
Right. And that's actually another question. Are there a lot of like random tables for start here? No,
not really. There are a couple of encounter tables, and I'm working on a system for solo play. I haven't got it quite where I want it yet, but I'm hoping to have it developed in time to go into the campaign sampler. That you can go in and you've got a set of tables that will say, well, in encounter area 1, encounter area 2, up through 20, because I'm only using a D20. And then you can determine what's in there as far as creatures and what's in there as far as treasures. But I would like a good simple solo system like that. That's good across all different sorts of settings. Originally, I was thinking of it as ghost towns for the Western setting, but I think it ought to be able to work for a dungeon or a derelict starship or any number of other things.
Got it. Okay. So then, all right. So we are running out of time. Now, all ones, as far as what so all ones does ask, what non D&D games do you play? We touched on that, I think, but if you want to just recap for all ones real quick since he's here.
Yeah, there's the whole school of D&D, which is D&D, Pathfinder, Everyday Heroes. Those I find enjoyable for the most part. Stargate, but I also do play Shadowrun at conventions, and I've enjoyed Deadlands for a couple of decades.
Fair enough. Yeah. And then also for this first start here, what games have you taken from to develop it?
Taken inspiration from? Well, a lot of the D20 system, of course, because it's the D20 system boiled down. But there's some things that you see in well, Shadowrun is a great concept.
I cover a lot of Shadowrun on the channel, so
yeah. Shadowrun is just a wonderful world, and I wish the rule system was a little cleaner.
I don't think anyone will argue with that.
But well, my world, the main world where Wizards and Wranglers, Zombie Source Rex, and Star X, and a half dozen other settings exist, at least in my head, is a continuous history, which partly comes from a game that I did for the Amazing Engine called Magitech, which was also partly inspired by games like Torg and Shadowrun. Because I really am fond of mixing genres and doing mashups. It's just something I do so automatically, and that's when I'm running the campaign games. There are so many Easter eggs. A couple of my players just, are looking stuff up constantly to see, who is that? And but it's something that I love. So the anything that mixes genres has been an inspiration. But especially, like I said, Shadowrun and Torg. There are little bits and pieces that I picked up from. Not even necessarily a specific source, but there's some GURPS and Warhammer stuff that kind of leads into the attack and damage system, where instead of rolling an attack and rolling damage, you're rolling attack and the target is then resisting damage if they get hit. So you see samples of that in some other games. And beyond that, it is extraordinarily difficult for me to tell because I absorb a lot, and I'll throw stuff out in a game that sometimes it's from a movie and sometimes it's from another game, and I can't even tell anymore.
No, sure, and I mean, and let's be honest, there's also the old saying, a good artist doesn't copy, they steal. So that, and you probably don't, like, you're a Kender, you don't even remember how it got there, it just showed up.
And there is an art to stealing too, so that I could say that you get away with it, but so that you do add an element of originality, the part where you don't get sued. So like the characters, some of the sample characters I mentioned in Zombie Source Rex, one that I just played with this past weekend was a character I created called Elfin John, who is the keyboard player, and he's been around in music for decades and is well known to everybody. But he's also an elf, and dresses flashy and has these funky glasses.
As an elf does.
Right. And, things like that, where it might be recognizable as a pastiche or a satire. But I also don't want to step on anybody's toes. A couple of the other characters in Zombie Source Rex are based on real people, but I don't have permission. And it wasn't quite enough to be satire. You don't have to be an elf.
But it's an option.
Yes. So, I don't want to, I also don't want to, copy somebody and offend them either. If I'm really going to copy somebody and it doesn't fall under satire or pastiche, then I absolutely want to get permission.
Sure. No, and that's totally understandable. So, all right. Well, now it is 9:15. We went first off, you gave me extra time. So very grateful for that. Everybody, there is a link in the description to the Kickstarter. Please absolutely go back that. Tim, I don't want you to go anywhere. We're going to say goodbye off stream. But I have to basically end it here because I've got to go to work. So everybody, thank you so much for being here. Tim, anything else you want to say before we end the stream?
Just, I do hope that people will back the Kickstarter because I really do want to get this into stores. I just firmly believe that this is the on-ramp into role-playing gaming that we've needed in the hobby for at least 30 years.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I said, what I've read off the Kickstarter, what you've talked about tonight, I'm very excited to see it, be able to try it out. Like I said, I backed it. I absolutely hope that we can get some additional eyeballs on this for you.
Yeah.
But also, you have been a fantastic guest. I appreciate that you've been very open with all of my questions. And I do hope to have you back at some point. So,
okay.
With that, everybody, thank you so much for watching. I hate to bounce like this, but I'm hitting the end broadcast. We're gonna make